Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen Haupt, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president. Welcome back, Father.
Well, Colleen, great to be back with you again. Been out in the mission field a little bit since our last podcast, so it's finally great to be back with you here and have an opportunity to talk about some of the issues affecting life and family.
Exactly. And it's good to be back in the studio. I've been doing a lot of, I guess I did the ones with the regional directors here, but all of my other ones I've been doing have been remote, which is great, but it's nice to actually be in the room and talk to someone face to face. So, yeah. So I was thinking for today's podcast, we could talk about what happens when abortion's banned. I know that you wrote an article on it a few months ago, and it was in response to another article that a pro-abortion group had written about all of the bad things that will happen, that they claim will happen when abortion's banned. So I thought we could discuss a little bit of the arguments that come up in that, the things that they bring up in that article, and then go into the positive benefits of banning abortions. So, and I will link both articles in the description so people can have some reference points for what we're talking about.
Very
good. So yeah. This article that you had been writing in reference to was talking about how when abortion's banned, women are just going to get illegal abortions. They brought up cases of women who weren't able to get abortions because they live in pro-life countries and then took pills from random pharmacists who were selling things off the market and ended up dying. So how should pro-lifers respond to this idea that if we ban abortion, women are just going to get, the coat hanger abortion, the random pill abortions, they're going to drink things that they shouldn't. How should we respond to that as pro-lifers and address a legitimate fear that women will get hurt, but just the whole situation?
Right. And I think, Colleen, that's what you just said is really how do we address, the issues of women who are in need? And so not instead need of abortion, we would never ever say there is ever that need, but those who are in crisis situations, those who are facing difficult dilemmas, maybe dealing with situations with domestic violence or dealing with situations in home environments or, corrupt systems and governments and, whatever those situations are, and so what happens in the article that was in The Wire, that's kind of what I'm addressing, from their point of view, they're thinking that, trying to, well up an amount of support that, we need abortion. And of course, where our response is, we don't need abortion. What we need is a legitimate response, to situations where women find themselves and a call for us to respond to that need, not to give them, and never to condone abortion, because as I began my article, that what we have to realize and what the two authors of the article in The Wire do not address is that someone dies here, and that's the unborn child who is the victim of this violent act called abortion. And so they never talk about it, never mention it. So it's important for us always to start there. But what you bring up, Colleen, is that, so what do? We know that from statistics and know from data that as we see now with Roe, with the overturning of Roe, that because abortion is not legal, do we see an increase in abortion? Matter of fact, we see the opposite. We're seeing a decrease in the number. The numbers are plummeting. And so what we have to do is look at, so what is our response, in these situations? And so sadly, what these two authors are doing, who are they're advocates for abortion. This is what they're advocating for. And so they're trying to, to use these very these situations to kind of gaslight a conversation and to get the conversation going where, hey, we have to make, the cocktail, what people call the abortion pill, available. We must make sure that we don't see any more restrictions on abortion at all. We need to make sure that abortion is always available. So this is what they're trying to do, is well up that support. Mm-hmm. And of course, using extreme situations, using situations that may in themselves be not always real. For example, the issue of the coat hanger, and so forth. But the reality is there are women who do face difficult moments and don't know where to turn. We, in the sense of, they have a domestic violence situation. There may be, and where they have no way of supporting themselves, much less their baby. So where do they turn? And so, of course, the pro-abortion sides, well, the answer is just have an abortion. And our answer is no, that our answer is we have to respond to that need. And so that's where our pregnancy care centers arise and so many other things. So I would just say that, as you make those links available, I think it's important, as a friend of mine who's working right now to produce more materials for how to address these issues that are being raised by the pro-abortion side, how to respond to the narrative, how to respond to the rhetoric. It's good for people to know what they're saying.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to do this podcast, because I thought it was interesting that I thought it was ironic that their article laid out all these reasons that women are going to get hurt because of banning abortion, and they're completely ignoring the fact that in every abortion, at least one person dies, sometimes two,
right,
depending on what happens to the mother.
Right.
But yeah, I guess that was a little reason I wanted to bring it up, is because it was interesting to read an article written in favor of abortion and say, okay, this is what they're saying. We need to know how to respond to it. And kind of along those lines, it's obviously important that you have the pregnancy care centers. There are resources for women in these situations, and abortion's never the answer, and illegal abortion is just as much not the answer as legal abortion. There's other places to go. Exactly,
Colleen. And I think, what right now our audience would be familiar with is what people are calling, with the abortion pill. Of course, I call it the cocktail because people don't realize there are two active drugs involved in this. And so we know that what's happening in the legal issue right now. But I mean, what this article in The Wire does not want to address is what happens, when someone is taking a drug in a home environment without doctor supervision? What happens, when something goes awry? And as we're seeing, there are many cases where something does happen, and it's not as easy as people are made to believe by just, quote, taking these pills. There are tremendous side effects. For example, no one's asked her if she is in an ectopic pregnancy. No one has really looked at the situations of her own health. Does she have cardiac problems? Does she have other issues? That's not being asked. We'll just mail you these pills. Just take them. So, of course, these two authors are not talking about that. They don't want to address that at all. We just have to have, access to abortion no matter what. And so no one wants to look at the situation, like, for example, when we have a domestic violence situation, abortion is not going to change that situation that she's coming out of.
It's going to cover it up.
Right. And it's going to protect him. But the child is the one that becomes the victim here of the aggression of the father. Mm-hmm. And so they're not talking about that. And let's be honest, as I bring up on the article, this just continues to let men off the hook, so to speak, and by not taking responsibility for their own actions. And it also allows, as I say in the latter part of my own column, where it allows politicians not to step up to what really needs to be done. And what are we doing to provide, legal protection? What are we doing to provide, legal protection for the unborn child, mm-hmm. legal protection, or making available resources and assets available for women who are in need, so that they don't ever have to think that the only answer to their dilemma is the death of their own child. As I've been writing very much of late, that should never be the answer. And it's shameful that that we really have made women to feel that this is the only answer to a situation they may find themselves in, and what people want to call a crisis or a difficulty. But to me, when I read this article and when it really stirred up all these feelings in myself, saying, and it actually made me angry at first, mm-hmm. because I'm thinking this is not honest. It's not honestly looking at the issue. And, as HLI has been, and I know that much of our audience may be familiar with or maybe not familiar with, I remember when I first came to HLI in 2011, we participated with other pro-life groups challenging those who were advocating for abortion to make these abortion facilities have the same requirements as any other medical facility. And, of course, we're not advocating for abortion. Neither were these pro-life leaders. What we were trying to do is expose the fact that a great majority of those who are advocating for abortion are really not necessarily concerned about, having the clinics as pristine as any other medical facility would be, following the regulations that every state would have for medical facilities.
Well, that goes back to Gosnell. When we did a podcast on Gosnell months ago, and it was talking about just how completely disgusting and gross his clinic, with quotes around that, because you can barely call it that, was.
Right. And no one signed on to it. I mean, we've done it a few times, and no one from the other side of the aisle would ever sign that, and it's very telling. It's very telling. People claim that we are, quote, one-sided, but in reality, we're not. In reality, they are.
I think pro-lifers can look at it and look at the multifaceted things that are going on and be like, okay, this woman needs financial help in this area, or she needs to get out of an abusive situation, or just look at the actual problem that's going on and give her individualized help to deal with whatever she's struggling with that's pushing her towards abortion, versus pro-abortion advocates look at it and they're like, oh, abortion, there's your answer, and move on. They don't actually help the woman. They just slap a easy pass,
Exactly.
even that's not really an easy pass.
And
but,
as we've talked about before, it really, and just that mindset creates a framework of how people approach these issues. And so it really, as John Paul, talked about in Evangelium Vitae, and many others, have talked about in the pro-life movement, is that it gives people an out that really should be stepping up and helping and being of support.
I never thought of comparing it to divorce before, but it makes me think a little bit of that. When you have no-fault divorce, there's no incentive for a couple to try to make their marriage work.
Correct.
And obviously, I'm acknowledged for our audience, there are situations of abuse where there needs to be a separation or something. But that aside, just situations where a couple are just not, quote, in love with each other anymore and they just have an easy out, there is that legally. And just kind of the same with abortion. When you say abortion is the only option, there's no incentive to try to actually help the mom or help her in her situation. They're just say, here's your easy out, kill your child and move on. And it doesn't solve her actual problem, and it just creates more trauma down the road.
Exactly. And I think that, the real challenge here is to really expose that this is the mindset that we're actually fighting. That's what Father Marx, said, it's a mindset, it's a framework, and it's a mentality. And it's really hard to undo once it's become so entrenched. And, I date myself. I was born in 1966. So really, I came a little bit before into this world before the legalization of abortion here in the United States. But we all know that abortion was legal in other parts of the world. And so this mindset, just continued to encroach. And today, depending on your age, it's just this is what you were raised in. This is what I heard from a friend recently, a married couple, whose child was diagnosed with a genetic abnormality. And thank goodness the doctor was wrong. But what the doctor wanted was them to have an abortion. And so, and because the doctor believed that this was their diagnosis. Well, they said, no matter what happens, we will love and accept our child. This is our child. And the doctor was incorrect. But again, imagine this.
But even if he'd been correct,
right? This is the doctor's mindset.
Yeah.
It's essentially it's just like changing a shirt that's been soiled. Let's just take the shirt off and let's just get a new shirt. This is the framework that's happening. So that's when I read the article. That's kind of what I was feeling. I was feeling a sense in that where is the legitimate response? And we know that the cases that are often used are going to be rape, incest. There are going to be situations where, like the article talks about, where in some countries where abortion is illegal, that women would be placed in jail, incarcerated because they had an abortion. We have always said, and many of us engaged in the pro-life movement said, it's not the woman that should be incarcerated, is the doctors and the people who are performing this violence that need to be held accountable, and those that have advocated pushed her in that direction. So, but they want to raise these up because do some of these things happen? Yes, they do. But they're not the norm, and so they're.
When they elicit an emotional response, you put in these stories, it makes you angry, and you want to do something about it, and then they're using that anger at an unjust situation to drive you towards support something that's even more unjust. Versus we should use that frustration or the anger that women are in these situations and use them to try to help them get out of those situations and help their child so that there's not two victims, that both victims are cared for and that. And
we also think about adoption. It's never ever mentioned, from the other side of the aisle, and because they again, it's just that's not the mindset. But we, of course, will advocate. A story that just came out of Cameroon. We talked about earlier about your podcast with our regional directors and some of our international team. And George from Cameroon just told me a story about a young woman where this practice is acceptable, where she welcomes her child, but realize that she can't care for her child, whatever the circumstance is, that they can bring the child to a legitimate authority, and the child will be cared for by the community, and our home will be found for the child. And George said it was a beautiful story because this little I don't know if it was a little boy, a little girl, so beautifully dressed, placed in a crib, and with a note, and left where the baby could be legitimately left, and the note just said, "Please give to my child what I wish I could." And it's heartbreaking because you can see in the heart of the mother that if the circumstances were different, at least in her, that she would love to be able to care for her child.
Well, and she gave the child something that no one else could, which
and
was
that's
life.
what she said. She did, yes. But she also realized that she had limitations.
Yeah.
And so she wanted her child to have things that she right now could not provide. And what George and I talked about is that if the situation had been known, maybe there could have been an opportunity to help her where she could have kept her child as well and found the help she needed. But at least as at the moment George and I talked, that was not the case. But it just showed how beautiful her love was, that she said yes to her child, welcomed her child into this world, and did not allow the violence of abortion to be the path that she could have taken, and instead welcomed her child, and then did something, even another heroic act, and that is she allows her child to be welcomed by someone else, to have a place to live and to have the need that the child requires answered.
I feel like I read a news story at one point months ago about them having similar things in the U.S., like places where there's like drop boxes basically for mothers who can't care for their children. Do you know anything about that?
Here in the States, I don't know any particular place, but I do know that typically they're firehouses, and police stations. Each state has their different requirements. But I do see that in different parts of the world, Colleen. Poland just comes to mind immediately, where I've seen, in particularly some of the religious houses and monasteries and convents, where they have a little opening in the door of the building of the convent, and it just turns. And so there's a bell inside, and so and the person comes, they place their child in, they ring the bell and turn it, and that's it. And the sister, there's always a sister or a brother that's available, So, and it's a place, and I've been in those places, and I've actually held some of the babies, and it's so beautiful. But I think that that even when you speak to the religious sisters and the brothers and lay people who are doing this phenomenal work, or in our country, the states that are allowing this to happen, to be able to care for people, I want to just peel that back, because in all these situations that I've had the chance to be in listening to the sisters, the brothers, the lay faithful involved, that when they meet sometimes later down the road, they may meet the mother or the father of these children. And inevitably they will say, I wish things were like today. I would be able to care for my child today. I'm in a better place today, And the response would have been, if we had known, maybe we could have resolved some of those issues at that very moment, where they could have maybe had that option. But at the same time, we need to still talk about adoption. And that never comes up in the wire at all.
Well, and going back to their question of like what happens when abortion's banned, hopefully if abortion's banned, it means we start putting those policies in place where it is easier to adopt, or there are places that parents who like can get the support they need, and if they absolutely like don't think that they can handle it right there's a place for them to give their child up for adoption.
And I think it's also with that, Colleen, if I may, it's also where the role of government here has a part to play in a good way. And you just said it perfectly, is to help using the principle of subsidiarity, but that is starting in the local communities. But if we have within our country a mindset where abortion is not ever a illicit option, where we eradicate that mindset, and it does not exist. It is not only not legal, it just does not, we do not accept it. And what happens is it'll require us to step forward. Like George in Cameroon said, the community comes together, that there are people who know what to do. They know how to respond. And people will sacrifice their own, in a sense, need to help the need of another person in need. And let's be honest, sometimes in our Western cultures, we've lost that understanding. When tragedies happen, tragic events occurs, natural disasters, you have people step forward, and that's a great thing. But then we kind of fall back again.
It's very isolated in the normal everyday life.
But if we can change that and come to the table and say, no, our response is at the lowest level is the community stepping forward, family stepping forward, local government stepping forward. Let's be honest. I mean, what happens in The Wire, they talk a little bit about it, not in great detail, but we have corrupt systems in governments. Look at the high inflation prices, high taxation. We have there are many things you can get access to But when there's a legitimate need of care because one finds her, and I just say her, sometimes it's a couple, it's a husband and wife. It could be some people who are in a civil union. It could be cohabitating. They don't know what to do. They're having a hard time, sustaining their own lives. But then they want to welcome their child. They don't want to do this. And this is what we hear more and more cases of. And so if we can then, the community come forward. And let's be honest, the church herself and many within the Christian community are doing yeoman's work in this regard and have been doing for decades. I mean, they are doing such admirable intervention in these moments. But imagine if we had greater resources and we had community resources and we had government resources that would use our taxes in an appropriate way, that we could provide greater opportunity for women and couples and families in need.
Well, like I was saying earlier, there's like the multifaceted aspect of the things the woman's struggling with, but there's also the multifaceted aspect of like all the different things that can go into helping it. Like if you have government systems in place and you have communities that are ready, like you said, the subsidiarity, if you had each level ordered towards protecting the family and welcoming life, there would be so many resources in place there to help the mother and help her in that situation.
Agreed.
And yeah,
absolutely. And that's what it should be. So in a situation, let's go back to some of the things brought up in the wire. So what is our response to a woman who has been raped?
Yeah.
What should be our response? What happens when there's a situation where there is domestic violence that has now resulted in the begetting of a child? So what is the response?
Not to create another victim.
Right. And abortion is not the answer here. But what is our response? And, and how do we address that? What do we do in situations where women are in a sense of thinking, there's no place for them to turn, so where, like in a local community, there should be something that is very clearly known that if someone's in this kind of need, this is where you go. Your
local pregnancy center, if you have one, that's a great place.
So there's so many ways to respond to this, but the main thing is not to allow that rhetoric, which has been around. I mentioned Dr. Bernard Nathanson in my article. Yeah. He talks about this. This is what he was doing. Fabricating numbers.
In the 70s? Is that when he was?
That's right.
Okay.
And so and actually, you can, in my article, I know you're going to link it, there'll be links to his comments, which allow people and to be able to see exactly what he said and what they were creating. And this is kind of what The Wire does again. They the two authors in The Wire, they just pick up rhetoric and they just kind of make up these situations. And like you said, it's to pull heartstrings. And and they can be very, very. They can tug pretty deep. When you hear them, and of course sometimes they've been so fabricated, it's hard to know where the truth really lies.
Yeah, that's true.
But that's the idea. But it's to pull people into the emotion.
Yeah.
And so, but I would say that we should be emotionally affected. And that's what moves us to give a better, the right response.
But emotionally affected to, like you said, give the right response, not to obviously support abortion.
Exactly.
They're trying to do. I wanted to touch quickly on one of the things they brought up was miscarriages. They had a story about a woman who was jailed for miscarriages, but I remember when we were doing the episode on the vote in Kansas back in September, people were saying that was a big thing of the rhetoric there too, was saying that women would get in trouble for having miscarriages, that because in like the medical community, they're termed like they fall under the like abortion, like not abortion as in directly killing a child, but whatever the medical term is that I forget for miscarriages in the medical community has the word abortion in it. How can we as pro-lifers reassure people that we are not targeting women? Like that is a tragedy if a woman loses a child in a miscarriage. How can we reassure people that pro-lifers want to care for her and they're not against them?
Right. And I mean, two different intentions and two different actions are occurring here. Yes. So obviously we're talking about the difference between a direct abortion, an intentional act to end the life of a preborn child, and the sad reality of a natural occurrence where there's a miscarriage. They are very different acts in very different situations. And, obviously, I've not heard of any case that I've seen, where a woman who has had a miscarriage, has been brought before some court. I mean, I've seen stories like this, but I'm not seeing anything legitimately that I've seen in any document to say this is why she's before the court. that would be far-fetched, for that to be done. And again, terminology can confuse people, in the sense of what the medical establishment may or may not be using to explain, a miscarriage. But for us, to look at the two different acts, the two different situations, and keep them, very separate, because one is a direct intention, and an act is done to bring that intention to bear. And that is to end the life of the preborn child. In the situation where a woman, has had, for whatever reason, the loss of her child. I just had a phone call just 2 days ago for two family members, lost. So a daughter-in-law and a daughter in the family lost their children, to miscarriage. So, and so the state is not going to quote, even in state pro-life states, they're not aiming the law at women of that nature. So I think it's important for people not to get caught into that. So if someone goes to the doctor, after having realized they've had a miscarriage, the doctor will realize that there's nothing has been done that's been to cause the death of this child. It would be different, obviously, if someone comes in and says, I used the RU486 pill, and this was that's a different situation. A different act has been done. Something has been done to actually bring about the death of the child.
So, like, if you were responding to that, if someone brought up that argument, you would basically just outline that, like, not outline sounds very educational and cold, but like you would basically lay out that an abortion is directly taking the life of a child. Right. A miscarriage is a tragedy that is an accident. Right. And
in an accident, in a sense, something naturally occurs that, yes. From some abnormality, some genetic issue, whatever has occurred has not been caused by an outside act or an intention.
And so just making it clear that pro-lifers, like, they're different things, and we recognize that, and right. Kind of explaining the nuance of what the pro-abortion people are twisting it to be, right. And being like, no, these are actually two separate things.
Right, and I think it's important for people not to get caught into that rhetoric, because, I have family members, who have lost children because of miscarriages, No fault of their own, and no explanation by doctors of why it occurred. So, but we can very easily know if a different act is chosen and an intention has been followed through on, and someone has actually done something to procure an abortion, chemically or surgically. We can obviously know those acts are very different. And in states where abortion is illegal, there is something that has happened that is not a legal act within that state. Miscarriage is not in that category.
Yeah, because I had 3 stories in there. So the first one was the case of illegal abortion. The second one was miscarriage. The third one, they brought up a situation where girls were banned from school because they had unplanned pregnancies. And I know we do a lot of work in pro-life countries that where women who have unplanned pregnancies can't always afford to go back to school. Correct. Which is slightly different situation. But can you just address from your hands-on knowledge of all these different countries, what things people are doing in third world countries to make sure that those girls can go back to school?
Right. And I think the one thing, working with pregnancy care centers and having been in school systems myself, working and ministering in those school systems, and you find situations like this. The first thing is obviously you don't want, to actually make her feel, the young woman in this situation, feel so guilty that, that she is in a situation like this, that it leads her to abortion. In other words, she becomes penalized. So you have to, the balance there is to also recognize, as you're teaching the rest of the students, that this situation is from a Catholic point of view. All right. Yes. So just using the approach from us as Christians and Catholics, we know that the gift of expression of conjugal love is that between a husband and a wife. That the expression of sexual intercourse is only to be expressed between a husband and a wife. So children are to be begotten as a result of the conjugal act and conjugal love. So outside of that, all right, we would say is not the path that the Lord has given and the Lord desires. So, but in this situation, this has occurred. So what do? The child is a gift, and is to be loved and to be welcomed and to be defended and always protected. So the first thing to do is to help the student body, to help the school realize that abortion is not the answer here, that the situation is a difficult moment, but we will stand with her, we will help her, we will support her, we will find the means to, with her family, do everything we can to love both. Love both. We serve both. Always important. At the same time, here, some systems, I've seen this, here in the States, and I've also seen it in other countries, and it's an arguable position. It's a prudential judgment. Sometimes what they will do is they may take her out of a classroom situation. Some people think, again, it's all prudential judgment.
Why would they do that?
It's a question, because some would think, well, maybe we wouldn't do this. We don't want to help other students think that, that this is an okay path. But that's why it's always a danger, because what it does is then if you isolate her or you treat her any differently, then it could lead someone else who might be in a similar situation. Well, I don't want to be treated that way. I don't want to be isolated. So that's always the danger. I always approach it, from the point of view is you welcome, you keep the situation as it is, and you find all the ways to help. By one, it's a time of education to the rest of the students, and it's also a time.
Subject.
Exactly, it's a time to talk about it, to look at it, not use her as a situation, because we don't want her to feel used or to be, mistreated or again isolated in some kind of way. But at the same time, we want the students to realize that there is there's culpability, there's responsibility, there are consequences to actions, and that now it's up to us and to help her, that is going to change path of life. It may alter sometimes her schooling for a little while, but it's not an end. It may put things on hold for a little while. Things may change for a moment, but there's a path forward. And it's just promoting a positive. Even as I'm discussing, I know some people may say, "Well, that doesn't sound too positive," but really it is. And
I mean, things happen all the time that make people delay schooling or things like that. I think that's a little bit different than yeah.
Right. And so, but I've seen in other countries, because their cultures are different, their way of approachment is different. And sometimes, I've seen in certain developed countries where they actually create a separate school, if you will. It's a parallel school. Where, because again, as she starts, moving toward the latter trimester, I mean, things are changing, and so they have different kind of all positive. There's nothing it's not meant to isolate. It's not with the mindset of isolation.
So it's just to prepare her for being a mother, basically?
Right, exactly. So they kind of balance it out by still providing her formation, her education, giving her the environment that she needs, but especially as she starts moving into the latter part where things are changing, she's not feeling well, but it's to work with them. And sometimes they'll also have a homeschool environment, in that situation. So I've seen different approaches, but I guess what I'm hopefully, trying to hopefully coming across and saying is that, the response is to support her and to recognize that the answer is that you don't want to give her, to push her such a point where she feels guilty and thinks that, and other women will say, well, again, as I mentioned earlier, well, I don't want to go that route because I don't want to be isolated. I don't want to be pulled out of the school. I don't want to be, treated differently, and so maybe if I'm in that situation, they may be more leaning, pardon me, toward abortion minded because they just don't want to go that path. So no, that's not their answer. So I think that, as we've seen,
it comes down to a prudential judgment of how the best way to help her in that situation. Is it to and how to help the other students not necessarily follow down that path, but at the same time not alienate her for a mistake that happened. Right.
A choice that has occurred. But to also see that there, with that is responsibility, which to me is important, and to realize that, that now our task is to be of support to her, to welcome her child and to welcome her, and not to condone maybe any of the reasons that brought us to this moment. And I think that's where the balancing is. And I think some schools struggle with it, especially within the Christian Catholic community, because, like with our pregnancy care centers, the moment someone walks through the door, we are here to help. Yeah. And the situation should be the same, is that this may not have been the path, in the sense of what ideally we would have wanted, but here we are.
Yes.
So let's walk this together.
And I think it's also just hearing stories about that. It's very important as Americans to recognize that it's a different culture and that what's acceptable in that culture, what's considered prudent in that culture isn't always what we would do here either. That it has to be, again, a case-by-case basis depending on the community and what's going on there.
Right.
too.
And there are situations, and I mean, people probably, on either side of the aisle can raise examples where someone's made to be, feels made to be treated in a way that they're made to feel shamed. That should not be the response either. It really is, as you said, situations occur. How many parents, who have raised their children in a moral environment, did all that they could, and their child, their teenager, their adolescent, young adult makes a choice and finds himself in such a situation. Of course, the parent is disappointed. Parent is saddened by the choice that has been made, but they still love them, they care for them, and what can we do to be of assistance? And I think that is the response. It's in that very moment, of course, there's going to be disappointment. I mean, that's just a natural response, but you move forward. And I think that's really the challenge. I just want to peel it back, if I could, just for a moment. And that's why I love what we're working toward as well, and many others, is how do you peel back so that we're not in such a situation? Which goes back to teaching the beauty of chastity, the beauty of self-worth and self-dignity, and helping people understand that there are consequences to every action, and especially in a sexual act. That the sexual act it can and often does result in the begetting of a child. And I think it's important to help people to see that, and in order to not be in such a situation, then the first choice is not to put yourself in that situation. Yeah. And but that's a different moment for a different podcast. But again, I think, just away from my own self, is, as I often do, by reading what the other side says, by reading what we are completely not in support of, but it helps us know what's being promulgated, what is the narrative, what is the language being used. And for us, and this is what I love about so many of the pro-life groups that are working with young college students, working within the youth environment in different levels of school, that they're able to make it more specific. They're able to address those issues very directly, and they do an admirable work in that. And I think that, so it's good to hear what they're also hearing, because we know that in the secular system, that the school system itself is geared toward the mindset that the two authors have.
Yes.
I mean, that's what we're up against.
When you realize just, what people need to hear, what they need to, this is what they're thinking based off of the arguments they're hearing in the media, and these are the actual issues that we need to address. These are the emotional responses that we need to be able to be aware of. Right. So that we can actually help them see the truth.
Right. So, exactly.
And that's why I wanted to have this podcast.
Well, hopefully it's helpful.
Yes. Thank you so much, Father. And to all of our listeners, please follow, subscribe, share with your friends if you enjoyed this. Drop ideas for future podcasts in the comments if you have anything you'd like to hear us talk about. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.